Before we begin today's story, I'd like to say a quick prayer for you, my dear family. May your days be filled with peace, your heart with joy, and your steps guided by light. Amen. If you're happy to be here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Rain fell in fine silver threads over the small town of Willow Creek, soaking the dark earth and turning the graveyard into a quilt of glistening black umbrellas. The church bell had tolled 12 times, deep, mournful strikes that seemed to echo in her bones. And still, Lila Morgan stood rooted at the edge of the crowd, her hands clutching the damp hem of her coat, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The mahogany casket lay suspended above the open grave, its polished surface beading with raindrops that slid down like tears. She had imagined she'd cry today, but her eyes felt dry and raw, as though the grief had moved deeper, into some place beyond tears. Around her, whispers curled through the air, muffled beneath the patter of rain and the murmured prayers of the minister. They weren't whispers of sympathy. She knew the difference. These were sharper, slicker, like knives wrapped in velvet. Hasn't even been home in years. Never helped with his business, not once. Useless, just like her mother was. The words were not loud, but in her hollowed state, each syllable landed like a pebble in still water, rippling through her chest. She wanted to turn away, to walk down the gravel path and disappear into the wet, gray afternoon. But her father was being lowered into the ground. Whatever else had passed between them, the distance, the silences, the bitter words, he was still her father. She owed him this last moment. When the rope creaked and the casket began to descend, Lila finally looked up, meeting the eyes of her stepbrother, Patrick. His suit was perfect, black wool tailored to his lean frame, and his expression was as unreadable as the surface of a mirror. He had been the golden child, the heir to Morgan and Sons Lumber, the family's thriving business, the one her father had proudly paraded at every town gala. Lila had been the shadow in the corner, the awkward, bookish girl who had left at 22 and rarely looked back. Patrick's gaze slid over her like she was no more than a stranger in a crowd. But his wife, Marissa, didn't bother with such restraint. She leaned toward one of the women beside her, a woman Lila vaguely remembered from Sunday school, and said, loud enough to carry. She couldn't even manage to send flowers for the service. What kind of daughter is that? Heat flared up Lila's neck. She didn't answer. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction, but her hand tightened around the bouquet she'd laid earlier on the casket lid. White lilies, her father's favorite. She'd placed them quietly, without an audience. That was her way. The minister's voice rose in final benediction, the words blurring in her ears. People began to drift away, their umbrellas bobbing toward the gravel path, voices low and somber. Lila stayed where she was until the last handful of dirt thudded softly onto the coffin. When she finally turned, she saw him, a man standing a little apart from the others, his umbrella tilted slightly back so that his face was bare to the rain. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit cut in clean lines that spoke of money and precision. His eyes, a deep, steady gray, were fixed on her not in pity, but in a way that made her feel seen. She didn't know him. At least she didn't think she did. But something in the stillness of his gaze sent a quiet current through her, the way a distant thunderclap promises a storm. Before she could look away, Patrick stepped into her path, blocking her view. Lila, he said, his voice coated with polite frost. We'll be reading the will tomorrow morning at the house. 10 sharp. Don't be late. She nodded once. His eyes flickered over her coat, her scuffed boots, as if cataloging the ways she didn't belong. Then he turned and walked away with Marissa on his arm. By the time she looked back toward the man in the rain, he was gone. The Morgan estate stood at the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian with white columns that seemed to pierce the low winter clouds. Lila had grown up in that house, or at least in the quieter rooms of it, away from the voices that filled the grand dining hall with laughter she was never part of. She arrived 5 minutes early, her boots crunching on the frost-crusted gravel of the drive. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing Mrs. Bennet, the housekeeper who had served the Morgans for nearly 40 years. Her eyes softened when she saw Lila. "You look tired, dear," Mrs. Bennet murmured, taking her coat. "They're all in the drawing room." "All?" Lila asked, her stomach tightening. "Patrick, Marissa, a few board members from a company, and," she hesitated, "Mr. Alastair Hayes." The name meant nothing to Lila. She frowned, but didn't press. Mrs. Bennet's voice carried a weight, though a subtle deference that told Lila this Mr. Hayes was not just another acquaintance of the family. The drawing room smelled faintly of leather and old wood polish. Sunlight streamed in through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the air like tiny ghosts. Patrick was seated at the head of the long walnut table, Marissa beside him in a crimson dress that clung like a second skin. "Glad you could join us," Patrick said, without warmth, as if she were late rather than early. Lila's gaze flicked to the far end of the table and caught the man from the cemetery. He sat with quiet authority, one hand resting lightly on a leather portfolio. No umbrella this time, no rain to soften the lines of his face, and yet the same steady presence. His eyes met hers unhurried, as if measuring something in her that she didn't know she possessed. "Lila Morgan," Patrick said, almost as an afterthought. "This is Alastair Hayes. He's here on behalf of the board to discuss certain business arrangements." "Business arrangements?" she repeated. Patrick didn't answer. Instead, Mr. Latham, the family lawyer, cleared his throat and began reading from a will. His voice was crisp, professional, but Lila's attention kept snagging on the quiet weight of Alastair Hayes's gaze. The will unfolded predictably at first. To Patrick went the controlling shares of Morgan and Sons Lumber, the estate property, the vacation cabin up north. To Marissa, a trust fund in recognition of her loyalty to the family. Then Mr. Latham's tone shifted. "And to my daughter, Lila Jane Morgan, I leave the sum of $25,000, as well as my collection of first edition poetry volumes, stored in the cedar trunk in the library." A ripple of muted surprise moved through the room. Patrick's expression didn't change, but Marissa's smirk was barely concealed. "Books," she said under her breath, just loud enough for Lila to hear. How fitting. Heat prickled at the base of Lila's neck, but she kept her face neutral. 25,000 wasn't nothing, but compared to the empire Patrick had just inherited, it was a whisper beside a shout. When the lawyer finished, Patrick rose smoothly to his feet. "I think that concludes things. Thank you all for coming." Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor. Papers shuffled. But before Lila could gather her bag, a deep, even voice spoke. "Actually," Alastair Hayes said, "there's one more matter to address." The room stilled. Even Patrick's mask slipped a fraction. Alastair stood, unfolding to his full height, and I turned toward him. "Your father approached me 3 months ago with a private request," he said, looking directly at Lila. "One he did not put in the will, but one he asked me to honor." Lila's heartbeat thudded in her ears. "He asked me," Alastair continued, "to ensure that you had a place and a purpose within the future of Morgan and Sons. He believed you had a mind for details and a perspective the company needs, and he asked me to see to it personally." Patrick's jaw tightened. "That's absurd. She's never worked a day in the business." "Not yet," Alastair agreed mildly, "but she will, under my direct mentorship." The words fell into the air like stones into still water, rippling outward. And in that moment, with every gaze in the room fixed on her, Lila realized what was happening. He was choosing her, in front of everyone. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Patrick's gaze burned into Alistair Hayes like he could set him alight with sheer will. "This is ridiculous," Patrick said, his voice clipped. "My father's will was clear. The company is mine. No one is disputing that," Alistair replied, his tone calm but edged with steel. "But your father was a man I respected, and his final request was explicit. Lila will be employed at Morgan & Sons in a role I will define and oversee. Consider it a personal contract between him and me." Lila sat very still, as though movement might shatter the fragile veneer of civility in the room. She could feel Patrick's anger like heat radiating from the far end of the table. Marissa's disdain curling around her like perfume she couldn't wash off. "And if she refuses?" Marissa asked sweetly, crossing one elegant leg over the other. "I mean, not everyone's cut out for real work." The jab landed, but before Lila could speak, Alistair's eyes found hers. "I hope she won't refuse," he said, and though his voice was even, there was a weight in it, not quite a command, but something that made her spine straighten. "But that's her choice." Lila swallowed. She didn't know this man, didn't understand why her father would entrust him with such a request. But she knew the room she was in. She knew the way Patrick and Marissa saw her, as an afterthought, a failure, and she wasn't ready to hand them the satisfaction of watching her walk away. "I'll do it," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Patrick's laugh was short, disbelieving. "You'll last a week." Alistair's gaze didn't leave hers. "We'll start Monday morning. My office. 9 sharp." He closed the portfolio on the table, the soft thud signaling the end of discussion. Patrick muttered something under his breath, Marissa smirked, and the board members busied themselves with polite farewells. When the room began to empty, Alistair approached her. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just in height but in presence. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, the kind that made it difficult to look away. "Your father spoke of you often," he said. Lila blinked. "I find that hard to believe." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Believe it. He was proud of your independence, even if he didn't say so." She didn't know how to answer that. The lump in her throat was sudden, unexpected. Before she could speak, Patrick's voice cut across the room. "Lila, a word." Alistair inclined his head in a small gesture of parting. "Monday, 9 o'clock." She nodded, and he walked out, his stride unhurried, leaving a faint scent of rain and cedar in the air. Patrick waited until the door closed before stepping closer, his voice low and sharp. "If you think this is some kind of opportunity, think again. He's not doing this for you. Whatever game he's playing, you're just a pawn." Lila met his glare. "Maybe, but a pawn can still cross the board." Patrick's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see how long you last." Monday arrived with a pale winter sun filtering through thin clouds. Lila stood outside the sleek glass building that housed Morgan & Sons headquarters, her reflection staring back at her from the polished facade. She smoothed her coat, told herself she could do this, and stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new carpet. Receptionists in sharp blazers tapped at keyboards, and the air hummed with a quiet efficiency that made her pulse quicken. "Mr. Hayes is expecting you," the receptionist said with a professional smile, pressing a button that summoned the elevator. On the top floor, the elevator doors slid open to reveal a different world. The space was flooded with light from floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the river. The walls were lined with art, bold, abstract strokes that seemed both chaotic and deliberate. And there at a desk of dark walnut sat Alistair Hayes. He looked up as she approached, setting aside the document in his hand. "You're on time," he said, as though it were the first test and she passed. "I said I would be." His gaze flickered with something like approval. "Follow me." He led her into a conference room where a stack of files waited. These are current contracts. I want you to read through them. Note any discrepancies or inconsistencies. Don't worry about speed. Worry about accuracy. She opened the first file, the smell of fresh paper and ink filling her senses. The work was meticulous, the kind that required patience, something she'd always had in abundance. Hours passed. He checked in once or twice, offering no unnecessary conversation. But she felt the weight of his awareness even when he wasn't in the room. When she finally looked up, the sky outside was streaked with the pink gold of late afternoon. "You are still here," he said when he returned, a note of surprise in his voice. "You didn't say I could leave." That earned her a small, genuine smile, brief, but enough to make her wonder what he looked like when he laughed. By the time Lila finished reviewing the last contract, the office was nearly silent. The hum of printers and phones had faded, replaced by the muted whoosh of the heating vents. Outside the windows, the city glowed in scattered lights against the indigo dusk. She gathered her notes into a neat pile, stretching her stiff fingers. That's when she noticed Alistair in the doorway. "You didn't have to stay this late," he said. "You told me to focus on accuracy," she replied. "That takes time." One dark brow lifted. "And did you find anything?" "A few things," she said, sliding the papers toward him. "This supplier's invoicing doesn't match their delivery reports." And here she tapped another file. "This contract renewal has a clause that wasn't in the original. Someone tried to slip it in." He picked up the papers, scanning them quickly. His expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the air, as if she'd just stepped onto a different part of the chessboard. "Good work," he said finally. The praise was simple, but something in the way he said it made heat creep up her neck. She wasn't used to being acknowledged for her competence, certainly not in her family. She glanced at the clock. "It's later than I thought." "The elevators still work after 5, he said, the faintest glint in his eyes. "But if you're hungry, there's a place down the street. The best tomato bisque in the city." The invitation, if it was one, caught her off guard. "Is that a business dinner?" His lips curved slightly. "If that makes it easier to say yes." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right." The restaurant was warm, softly lit, the kind of place where the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation created a cocoon from the cold outside. They were seated in a corner booth, steam curling from bowls of biscuit with basil and cream. For a while they spoke of safe topics, the history of the company, the logistics of the contract she'd reviewed. But somewhere between the second slice of warm bread and the last spoonful of soup, the conversation shifted. "You said at the will reading that my father spoke of me," she said quietly. "What did he say?" Alistair's gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "That you didn't see yourself the way he saw you, that you underestimated your own worth." Her chest tightened. That doesn't sound like him. Maybe not the him you knew, but people are complicated. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her bowl. "He called me impractical once. Said I'd never survive in the real world. Yet here you are." Something in his tone, matter of fact, without pity, loosened a knot inside her she hadn't realized was there. She found herself telling him about leaving town at 22, about the cramped apartment in the city, the string of temporary jobs, the nights she wondered if coming back would mean admitting failure. He listened without interrupting, his attention like a steady flame. When she finally fell silent, he said, "Maybe coming back doesn't mean you failed. Maybe it means you're not done here yet." She looked up, and for a moment the space between them felt charged, like the instant before a storm breaks. She told herself it was nothing, just gratitude for being heard. But the warmth in her chest lingered long after the check arrived. The next morning, the whispers began. It started in the elevator. 2 junior accountants talking just low enough to think she wouldn't hear. Working directly for Hayes? Must be nice. Bet Patrick's thrilled about that. By lunchtime, the glances followed her in the hallways, curious, speculative. In a place like this, proximity to the CEO, even in a mentorship role, was its own kind of currency. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in the contracts Alistair had assigned. But when she brought a file to his office, just after 3, she caught the tail end of a phone call. His voice was low-clipped, the way people speak when they're both tired and dangerous. "Yes, I'm aware of who's behind it," he said. "And no, I won't let him drive her out." He hung up, the muscles in his jaw tight, and for a heartbeat, she wondered if he'd been speaking about her. But before she could ask, he said, "Close the door, Lila. We have a problem." Lila closed the office door behind her, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. Alistair leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed on her in that steady, evaluating way that made it hard to breathe evenly. "Patrick," he said finally. She blinked. "What about him?" "He's been quietly pushing to have you removed from your role here." "I knew it was likely, but I didn't think he'd move this fast." Lila's stomach tightened. "And you know this because—" "I have my ways," he said, with a faint glint of something that might have been humor, though it vanished almost instantly. "He's been talking to a few board members, making the case that you're a distraction, that you don't have the qualifications to handle what you're doing." The words stung, but they weren't surprising. Patrick had been telling her variations of that story for most of her life. "So what now?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Now," Alistair said, "we make it harder for him to get rid of you. You're going to take on something more visible, something that forces the board to see your value before he can rewrite the narrative." She hesitated. Visible meant attention. Attention meant more whispers, more speculation. But the quiet steel in his tone made her straighten in her chair. "What exactly did you have in mind?" 2 days later, she found herself in a conference room surrounded by blueprints and financial reports. Alistair stood at the head of a table, explaining the upcoming expansion project into 3 neighboring counties. "It's the largest growth initiative Morgan & Sons has undertaken in a decade," he said. "And you," he glanced at Lila, "will be responsible for coordinating vendor compliance and supply chain accuracy." One of the senior managers, a man with a voice like gravel and a tie patterned with tiny anchors, frowned. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, isn't that a little ambitious for someone so new?" "Ambitious," Alistair said smoothly, "is exactly what this requires." Lila felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She didn't flinch. After the meeting, she caught up to him in the hallway. "You just threw me into the deep end," she said. "You'll swim," he replied, as if it were fact rather than opinion. Then, after a pause, "And if you don't, I'll make sure you don't drown." Something in his tone, quiet, unwavering, made her pulse trip unexpectedly. The following weeks blurred into long hours and constant learning. Lila spent her days on the phone with vendors, buried in contracts and double-checking shipment logs. At night, she pored over technical manuals in her small apartment, her dinner going cold beside her. More than once, she looked up to find Alistair standing in her doorway after most of the office had emptied. Sometimes he offered advice. Sometimes he asked questions that forced her to think 3 steps ahead. One Thursday evening, they ended up working side by side at the long conference table, papers spread around them like the remnants of a quiet battle. "Here," he said, sliding a report toward her. "Notice anything?" She scanned the numbers, the smell of his cologne, cedar and something darker, filling the air between them. "This supplier's charging for expedited shipping on every order, even the ones that aren't urgent." His mouth curved slightly. "You're getting faster." "I had a good teacher," she said, before she could stop herself. For a moment, the air seemed to still. His eyes met hers, and the flicker there, warm, intent, just on the edge of something unspoken, made her look back down at the papers. The progress she made didn't go unnoticed. Vendors began addressing her directly instead of going through Patrick's office, and two board members congratulated her on catching errors that had saved the company thousands, which made it all the more suspicious when one Friday afternoon, she received an urgent email from a supplier claiming her approvals had caused a shipment delay worth tens of thousands of dollars. The problem? She hadn't approved anything that week. When she showed the email to Alistair, he scanned it once and said, "It's a setup. The timestamps don't match your access logs." "And you think Patrick?" "I don't think," he said, his voice low and certain. "I know." She exhaled sharply. "What now?" He leaned back, studying her. "Now, we let him think it's working. And when the board meeting comes next week, we'll make sure the truth comes out in front of everyone." The boardroom at Morgan & Sons was built to impress. High ceilings, walnut paneling, and a long table polished to a mirror shine. Lila had sat in it once as a child, swinging her legs under the chair while her father and Patrick talked business above her head. She remembered feeling small, invisible. But not today. Today she sat near the end of the table with a folder of neatly compiled notes in front of her, her shoulders square despite the flutter in her chest. Across the table, Patrick was already in full stride, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "And as you can see, the shipment delays cost us $38,000 in penalties, a result of negligence in our new compliance oversight." Every eye shifted toward Lila. The word negligence echoed in her ears like a gavel striking wood. "Mr. Hayes," one board member said carefully, "is this the kind of oversight you envisioned when you placed Ms. Morgan in this position?" Alistair didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder Lila had given him before the meeting and slid a page across the table. "This," he said, his voice even, "is the actual approval log from our system. As you'll notice, the supposed approvals tied to Ms. Morgan's name were submitted on a Saturday evening at 11:47 p.m. A pause. Heads bent over the document. "Our office was closed," Alistair continued. "Our system doesn't allow remote logins without my authorization. And Ms. Morgan was with me at a vendor dinner that evening." Heat crept up Lila's neck, though it wasn't embarrassment. It was something sharper, stronger, like standing in the sun after weeks of shadow. He hadn't just defended her. He'd anchored her presence to his own. "So if she didn't approve these shipments," another board member said slowly, "then someone else did. Someone who wanted her blamed," Alistair said. His gaze flicked toward Patrick, brief but unmistakable. "And I won't tolerate sabotage within this company." Patrick's jaw worked, but he said nothing. The room shifted, murmurs, nods, the balance of judgment tilting. For the first time, Lila wasn't invisible at this table. She was central. When the meeting adjourned, she gathered her papers with careful hands, her pulse still thrumming. As she rose, Alistair leaned close enough that his voice was for her alone. "You held your ground," he said quietly. "That's what matters." She looked up at him, the lines of his face softened by the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "You didn't have to defend me like that." "Yes," he said simply, "I did." Word of the confrontation spread quickly. By the next morning, the entire office seemed to know about the forged approvals, though no one spoke openly. What they did speak of, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in sideways glances, was the way Alistair had tied himself to her defense. Lila felt the weight of it with every step she took down the hallway. Respect from some, resentment from others, and from Patrick, open hostility. That evening, she found him waiting outside the building, leaning against his black sedan. The fading sunset painted sharp shadows across his face. "You think you want something today?" he said, his voice low and tight. "You think standing next to Hayes makes you powerful?" "I don't think anything," she replied, gripping her bag strapped tighter. "I'm just doing the work." He stepped closer, the sharp scent of his cologne hitting her. "You don't belong here, Lila. You never have. And no matter what tricks Hayes plays, you won't change that." Before she could respond, another voice cut in. Is there a problem? Alistair stood a few paces away, his presence filling the space like a shadow stretching across the pavement. Patrick straightened, his expression smoothing into something almost pleasant. No problem at all, he said. Then, with one last glance at Lila, he slid into his car and drove off. Silence lingered in his wake. Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You don't have to keep rescuing me, she said, half to herself. Alistair's eyes held hers. I'm not rescuing you. I'm standing with you. There's a difference. The words landed deeper than she expected, like stones sinking into water. A week later, they were back in the conference room, knee-deep in expansion proposals. Lila had just caught another irregularity in the supplier lists when she noticed him watching her, his pen stilled above the page. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. You don't flinch, he said. Flinch? Most people in this room, when challenged, they hedge. They soften their words. You don't. You just state the fact and move on. She blinked. That's not exactly a compliment. Some people think I'm blunt. I think, he said slowly, it means you see things clearly. That's rare. The air between them shifted, quiet and charged. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something unguarded in him, a crack in the armor of control he always wore. It unsettled her, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was too welcome. She looked back at the papers quickly, but her pulse beat louder than the rustle of the pages. The invitation had arrived in a heavy cream envelope, her name written in looping black ink. Annual Morgan & Sons Charity Gala. The card read, though she knew it was less about charity and more about networking in gowns and tuxedos under chandelier. She hadn't planned to go. Crowds weren't her comfort zone, and the thought of seeing Patrick surrounded by old family acquaintances made her stomach tighten. But Alistair had appeared at her desk 2 days before the event with that unreadable look of his. You'll be there, he said, not quite a question. And so she was. The hotel ballroom shimmered with gold light, the air warm with the scent of champagne and expensive perfume. Lila smoothed the skirt of her navy dress and tried to ignore the sensation of eyes on her as she moved through the crowd. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the room that she saw him, Alistair, in a perfectly tailored black suit, speaking with a small cluster of donors. His eyes found hers almost instantly, the faintest curve touching his mouth. When the conversation broke, he crossed the room to her. You clean up well, he said quietly, his gaze lingering a beat longer than necessary. She arched a brow. Is that your version of a compliment? That's my version of understatement, he replied. Before she could answer, Patrick's voice cut in from behind her. Lila, I'm surprised you came. She turned to see him flanked by 2 board members, his smile polite but edged. You remember Mr. Keating and Ms. Farrow, he said smoothly. They were just saying how unfortunate it was about that shipment delay last month. Her pulse ticked faster, but before she could open her mouth, Alistair stepped slightly forward, his presence an anchor at her side. That matter was resolved in the boardroom, he said evenly. No need to rehash it here. Patrick's smile thinned. Of course. Enjoy the evening. When he moved away, Lila exhaled. You have a habit of materializing at exactly the right moment. I keep telling you, Alistair said, his eyes steady on hers. I'm not rescuing you. I'm making sure you have the space to stand. The music shifted, a slow, low hum of strings. Around them, couples began to drift toward the dance floor. Lila hesitated only a moment before Alistair extended a hand. Just once around the floor, he said. She placed her hand in his, the warmth of his palm startling in its steadiness. As they moved through the soft tide of dancers, she became acutely aware of the closeness. The faint brush of his shoulder against hers, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. It wasn't the kind of silence that pressed down. It was the kind that drew you in. Later, she found herself on the terrace. The cool night air, a welcome relief from the glittering heat inside. She leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out at the city lights flickering like distant constellations. "You disappeared," Alistair's voice said behind her. "I needed a moment," she replied, not turning. His footsteps came closer. It's not easy, being in a room where every conversation is half about you and half about the person you're with. She glanced at him then, catching an expression she hadn't seen before, something quieter, less guarded. "You speak from experience?" He looked past her at the skyline. "My father used to bring me to events like this. I was the kid who didn't belong, the one they tolerated because of his last name." She hadn't expected him to offer anything personal, and the admission softened something in her chest. "And now you're the one they're watching." His mouth curved faintly. "And now I choose who I stand next to." The words lingered between them, almost tangible. For a moment, it felt like if she just took one step closer, the entire balance between them would shift. But the sound of footsteps approaching broke the thread, and they both turned away from the city lights. The following Monday, the office was back to its usual hum, but the gala seemed to echo in Lila's mind. She caught herself thinking about the warmth of his hand at her back as they moved through the crowd, the steady way he'd looked at her on the terrace. If he noticed her distraction, he didn't mention it, but his presence felt subtly different, not warmer exactly, but more attuned, as if some unspoken understanding now colored the space between them. That afternoon, as they reviewed the latest vendor bids, he asked without looking up, "Do you trust me?" The question startled her. "Why?" "Because the next move we make," he said, "is going to put you in the center again. And if you're not ready for that, we'll wait." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" He finally looked at her, and there was no mistaking the quiet intensity there. "Patrick's been maneuvering for a seat on the Expansion Oversight Committee. If he gets it, he'll have the perfect vantage point to undermine every decision we make. I want you to take that seat instead." Her mind raced. It would be public. It would be political. It would be war. "I'll do it," she said, before she could second-guess herself. Something flickered in his gaze. Approval, yes, but also something warmer, almost proud. "Good," he said. "Then we start tomorrow." The Expansion Oversight Committee met every other Wednesday in a smaller, glass-walled conference room on the top floor, intimate enough that every shift of expression was visible, but public enough that there was always an audience in the hallway outside. When Lila walked in, folder in hand, conversations paused just long enough for her to feel the weight of it. Patrick was already seated, his smile polite but tight, as though he'd bitten into something sour and was forcing himself to swallow. Alistair, in his usual spot at the head of the table, gestured for her to take the empty chair at his right. "Welcome, Lila," one of the senior architects said with a practiced smile. "This is a big leap from vendor coordination." "I like challenges," she replied evenly, ignoring the slight lift of Patrick's brow. The meeting moved quickly. Budgets, zoning applications, projected timelines. She stayed quiet at first, taking notes, letting the rhythm of the discussion settle in her mind. But when Patrick began pushing for a cheaper material supplier, something in her sharpened. "That vendor's contracts have a 30-day hidden clause for penalty fees," she said, sliding a copy of her research across the table. "They'd cost us more in the long run." Patrick's jaw tightened. "That's speculation." "It's documented," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Across the table, Alistair's glance was quick but approving, the faintest nod anchoring her in place. By the time the meeting ended, she'd spoken twice more, countering Patrick's proposals with precise, quietly devastating evidence. The blowback came faster than she expected. That evening, she found a message in her inbox from HR requesting a private conversation about her professional conduct in committee. She stared at the email for a full minute before calling Alistair. He answered on the second ring. "I was expecting this," he said. "You were?" Patrick Doesn't like losing. He'll use whatever he can, even the suggestion that you're being influenced. Her throat tightened. Influenced. You're in a visible seat next to me, he said plainly. People will make assumptions. That you're only there because I put you there. That we're... He stopped himself, and the unspoken word seemed to hang in the line between them. She forced her voice steady. And what do we do about that? We stay the course, he said. We make it impossible for them to argue with the results. The next committee meeting was a week later, and Lila came prepared. She'd spent every spare moment combing through bid histories, cost projections, and supplier audits until her eyes ached. Halfway through the agenda, Patrick pushed for a contractor he claimed was proven and reliable. Lila let him speak, then slid a thick folder onto the table. This is their last 3 major projects, she said. Each went over budget by an average of 20%. The reasons range from unforeseen complications to material shortages, which coincidentally occurred right after they took on new private clients. There was a long silence. Then one of the board members leaned forward. Mr. Morgan, is there a reason you didn't disclose this? Patrick's mouth tightened. That's irrelevant. It's relevant, Alistair cut in, his voice quiet but final. By the end of the meeting, Patrick's proposal had been voted down. They didn't speak as they left the room, the hallway full of murmured speculation. But when they reached the elevator, Alistair pressed the button and glanced at her. You were sharp in there, he said. Precise. Unshakable. She looked at him, trying to gauge whether this was just professional approval or something more. I learned from best, she said lightly. The doors opened, and they stepped inside. For a moment in the quiet hum of the elevator, their eyes met, and something in the air between them shifted, heavier, closer. Then the doors slid open, and the moment passed. By Friday, she could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she walked into the break room, in the sidelong glances passed between junior staff. Someone had started talking, and not about the committee's budget battles. She overheard 2 assistants in the corridor, sits next to him every meeting. And suddenly, she's got more say than people who've been here years. Exactly. You don't get that kind of leap, unless... The rest was swallowed by the sound of a copier. When she stepped into her office, Alistair was already there, leaning against her desk. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was quiet. You've heard it too. She set her bag down. I thought we were going to make it impossible for them to argue with results. We are, he said, straightening. But that doesn't stop them from trying to undermine you personally. The difference is, now they're starting to target me through you. Her pulse skipped. What do you mean? They're hinting that my decisions are compromised, that I'm distracted. He met her gaze, and the weight of what he wasn't saying pressed between them. That weekend, they met in his office not for strategy, but to decide whether to push forward or step back. If I withdraw from the committee, she said, Patrick wins. And I go back to coordinating shipments while you fight alone. If you stay, Alistair countered, they'll keep twisting it until every move I make looks like favoritism. She hesitated, then asked, and if that's what they think anyway? His jaw worked, the muscle in his cheek shifting. Then they'll eventually decide they were right all along. She folded her arms. Let them. I'm not going to step down because they're uncomfortable with me holding my own. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he leaned forward across the desk. If you stay, Lila, you have to understand. It's not just the work they'll come after. They'll dig. They'll find anything they can to use against you. And against me. Something flickered in her chest. Fear. Yes, but also the sharp edge of resolve. Then we make sure they find nothing that can break us. They began meeting outside the office, coffee shops on the edge of the city, quiet corners of libraries, anywhere they could talk without curious eyes tracking every exchange. He gave her access to more internal documents than she'd ever seen. trusting her with details that could shift the committee's balance in their favor. And slowly, she began to see the cracks in Patrick's veneer. Contracts with vague terms, invoices approved without signatures, relationships with suppliers who had histories of late deliveries. Every file was another thread in the net they were weaving. And she knew it was only a matter of time before Patrick realized the trap closing around him. It happened on a Tuesday morning. An anonymous email landed in her inbox. A grainy photo of her and Alistair at a cafe, heads bent together over a folder, his hand resting lightly on the table between them. The subject line read, "So professional?" Her stomach dropped. Whoever sent it hadn't just been watching. They wanted her to know. She forwarded it to Alistair with 2 words. "We've been made." He called immediately. "Do not respond to it. Do not mention it to anyone. We find the source first." But even as she agreed, she knew the damage was already seeded. The photo didn't prove anything, but in a building already buzzing with suspicion, it didn't need to. By the next morning, the photo had made its silent rounds. It wasn't on any public company channel, that would be too obvious. But it had been accidentally left open on a shared printer, and screens discreetly tilted just enough for someone passing by to catch it. At the coffee station, a junior analyst smirked when Lila poured herself a cup. "Careful," he said lightly. "Rumor is you drink your coffee with extra sugar these days." She met his gaze and didn't blink. "Rumor is free. Proof costs more than you can afford." He looked away first. When she returned to her office, Alistair was waiting in the doorway. "It's moving faster than I expected," he said. "We need to counter before it solidifies as truth." "How?" she asked. "If we deny it, they'll just say we're covering. If we ignore it, they'll say it's because it's true." His eyes darkened slightly. "Then maybe we give them something else to talk about." 2 days later, at the quarterly all-hands meeting, Alistair did something no one anticipated. He called Lila to the stage during his presentation. "This quarter's operational success," he told the full staff, "is due in no small part to the diligence of our vendor oversight. In particular, one member of the expansion committee whose research saved us from a 7-figure loss." The applause was polite at first, then genuine as people realized he was pointing directly at her. She stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing into her ribs. It was a calculated move, not a romantic gesture, but a professional one that made it harder to paint her as an unqualified favorite. Still, she could feel the murmurs in the air. Why her? What's between them? That evening, they met again in the quiet of his office. "You just painted a target on yourself," she said, leaning against the window frame. "I already had won," he replied, setting down his pen. "This way, at least, you're not standing there alone." She hesitated, then asked, "Is that why you did it? To protect me?" His gaze held hers for a beat too long. Let's call it evening the odds. Something in her chest shifted, a warmth laced with danger. They were towing a line neither had named aloud, but both felt pressing closer every day. That night, long after she'd left, her phone rang. "I found the source," Alistair said, without preamble. The photo came from Patrick's assistant. She sent it to 3 department heads before it reached the rest of the building. Lila's stomach tightened. "So Patrick's behind it. He's escalating," Alistair said. "And if we're going to stop him, we'll need more than committee wins. We'll need something he can't survive politically." There was a pause, and then softer. "Are you still in this with me?" She didn't hesitate. Yes. The plan wasn't simple. It couldn't be. Patrick had been in the company long enough to sense obvious threats, and if they moved too directly, he'd vanish into the shadows with his influence intact. Instead, they decided to give him an opportunity, something tempting enough to make him reckless. "There's a supplier proposal coming next week," Alistair explained, spreading the documents across the table between them in the dim light of his office. "It's legitimate on paper, but there's a flaw in the penalty clause. If Patrick pushes it through, The board will see it as negligence or worse. And if he does? Lila asked. Then we plant the next one. Eventually he'll bite. Men like him always do when they think they're untouchable. She leaned over the table, scanning the contract. Their shoulders nearly brushed, and she felt the air between them change, subtle, but charged. It was almost midnight when they finished. The city outside dark except for the flicker of distant traffic lights. She gathered the papers, aware of how quiet the room had become. You know, she said, breaking the silence. This is the longest I've stayed in the office since I started here. He gave a faint smile. And yet you're still standing. She returned it, but the moment held longer than it should have. There was a gravity to his gaze, as though they were both aware of an unspoken choice hovering between them. But then he turned away, reaching for his coat. Go home, Lila. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start the waiting game. 3 days later, the proposal came before the committee. Patrick spoke first, praising the supplier's efficiency and cost-effectiveness, as though he'd written the brochure himself. Lila kept her expression neutral, but her pulse thudded in her ears. Alistair asked a few pointed questions, not enough to derail the pitch, but enough to make it clear he was scrutinizing the deal. Patrick, confident, pressed harder. This is exactly the kind of contract we need if we're serious about growth. By the time the vote was called, Patrick had swayed enough members to push it through. Lila glanced at Alistair across the table. His expression didn't change, but she saw the smallest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. The trap had been set. They didn't have to wait long. Within a week, the supplier missed a key deadline, triggering the penalty clause that Patrick had failed to notice. The fallout began immediately. Emails flew. Department heads scrambled to adjust schedules. The board requested an urgent review. And in the middle of it all, Patrick was summoned to explain himself. When Alistair told her, there was no gloating in his tone, just quiet resolve. This isn't the end yet, but it's the first crack. Patrick didn't go quietly. 2 days after the board meeting, a memo appeared in the company's internal communications, unsigned, but clearly from his camp. It questioned the integrity of the expansion committee and implied that certain members had external motivations influencing their decisions. It didn't name her, but it didn't have to. That afternoon, she found her inbox flooded with requests for clarification, subtle jabs disguised as professional inquiries. By the third one, she realized the memo had done exactly what Patrick wanted, made her the focal point of suspicion. She walked into Alistair's office, dropped the printed memo on his desk and crossed her arms. This isn't just about him saving himself. He's trying to ruin me. Alistair read it slowly, then looked up. Which means you've become enough of a threat to scare him. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, he said, standing. But it should tell you we're close to breaking him. That evening, they stayed late, going over every document, every thread they could pull to tighten the net around Patrick. At some point, she leaned back in her chair, exhaustion pressing down. I don't know how you've done this for years, she admitted. The constant watching your back, the politics, the games. He set down his pen, his gaze steady. You learn to live with it, until someone comes along who makes you want to win for reasons beyond survival. She froze. His words hung in the quiet, heavy and unguarded. For a moment, she considered asking if he meant her, but the look in his eyes already told her the answer. It was nearly midnight when she finally stood to leave. He walked her to the elevator, the corridor empty, the hum of the lights above the only sound. When the doors opened, she stepped inside, and he remained in the hallway. But just before they closed, his hand shot out, stopping them. He stepped in beside her. Neither spoke as the elevator descended, but she felt the charge in the air, the way his presence filled the small space. When the doors slid open at the lobby, he didn't move immediately. Get some rest, he said at last, his voice low. But his eyes told her what his words didn't. The next morning, news spread fast. Patrick had been called into a closed-door board session. No one knew exactly what was discussed, but whispers said it wasn't going well for him. When Alistair returned from his own meeting with the board, there was a rare lightness in his step. "We've got him," he told her quietly. "But we need one more push, one more piece that makes it impossible for them to keep him." She nodded, but her mind wasn't just on the victory. It was on the elevator. And the moment they'd almost stepped over the line. The final piece came from an unexpected source. An accounting intern named Marissa, who out of frustration with Patrick's dismissive attitude, quietly forwarded an internal invoice to Lila's department. The invoice linked Patrick to an unapproved consulting firm, one that charged triple the normal rate for services that didn't appear in any project logs. "This is it," Lila said, sliding the printed invoice across Alistair's desk. "Even the board won't ignore this." His lips curved faintly. "Then let's make sure they see it from the right angle." The right angle meant they would present the findings together at the quarterly compliance review, in front of the entire senior leadership team. The conference room was at full capacity. Executives, department heads, legal counsel, all seated, all watching. Patrick sat 3 chairs down from Lila, his expression tight but confident, as though certain they wouldn't dare confront him outright. When their turn came, Alistair stood. "Before we proceed with the rest of the agenda," he began, "there's a matter of procurement oversight that requires immediate attention." Lila took her cue, sliding the invoice and accompanying documents onto screen. This vendor was paid more than 3 times the standard rate for undefined services. The authorizing signature belongs to Patrick. The ripple of murmurs was instant. Patrick's jaw tightened. "This is taken out of context." "Then explain the context," Alistair cut in, his voice sharp enough to still the room. Patrick hesitated. Too long. The damage was done. By the end of the week, Patrick had been invited to resign. The announcement was worded to save face, but the truth was clear to anyone paying attention. He'd been taken down, and Alistair and Lila had done it. They were the last 2 left in the office that evening. The weight of weeks of maneuvering finally lifting. "You should feel proud," Alistair said quietly. "You didn't just survive this, you won." She gave a faint smile. "Not alone." His gaze lingered, and for once he didn't look away. The air between them was too full, too electric. The unspoken finally pressing too hard to ignore. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of them. But suddenly the space between them was gone. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't reckless. It was the kind of step forward that had been building for weeks. The kind that felt inevitable. But before anything else could happen, his phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the moment. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Board chair," he said, stepping back. "I have to take this." She nodded, forcing herself to breathe evenly as he left the room. But the truth was undeniable now. The line they'd been dancing around wasn't a line anymore. It was a door half open. The next morning, the office felt different. Patrick's departure was the talk of every corridor, whispered in clusters by the coffee machines. People glanced at Lila now with a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. Alistair was nowhere to be seen until late morning, when he walked in with his usual measured pace, a file tucked under his arm. He stopped by her desk, leaning slightly so his voice carried only to her. "Walk with me." They ended up in the corner conference room, the glass walls giving them a view of the skyline. He set the file down but didn't open it. "We've been circling something for weeks," he said. "I'm not in the habit of avoiding things." Her throat felt tight. "I try not to." "Then I'll say it," he continued, his tone even, but his eyes unwavering. "I want you here in the company, but I also want you in my life. And those 2 things make this complicated." For a long moment, neither spoke. The city outside kept moving, oblivious. Finally, she stepped closer. You've been the one telling me not to let other people define me. So why start now? His lips curved, but it wasn't amusement. It was something warmer, almost relieved. You're right. The space between them vanished. His hand came up to her cheek, not tentative this time, but certain. When he kissed her, it wasn't the slow build they'd been living in. It was the release of everything they'd held back. When they pulled apart, she felt the weight of what they'd just done, and the certainty that there was no going back. A knock at the door broke the moment. The board chair stepped in, expression unreadable. I hope I'm not interrupting. There's an offer I need to discuss with both of you. They exchanged a glance, the kind that said we'll finish this later. But beneath it was something unshakable. Whatever came next, they weren't standing on opposite sides anymore.